The number one thing that you need to be crystal clear on as a small business CEO is what your aspirational culture is. Too many CEOs will just wing it when it comes to culture. And the problem is, if you don't define your aspirational culture now before you start hiring, afterwards, what happens is the culture just happens to you. So in order to take a more intentional approach to creating an organization and a high performance culture in your company, you have to think about what that culture is that you really want. My name is Sadaf Sheikh, and over the last 20 years, I have made it my mission to study organizations big and small to really see what makes organizations and high performing cultures that unique. And the one thing that I have found time and time again is that when CEOs are intentional about the culture that they are trying to create and they go about making it happen intentionally, the outcome is generally a high performing environment. When CEOs take a more reactive approach and hire because they feel they need to plug holes in the business, culture seems to happen to them, and they're left with a mess of an organization that does not match the values that they had defined for their organization, and it doesn't define the values that they tout to their customers either. So in today's video, I'm going to share why you need that aspirational culture and some key tips on how to actually define that aspirational culture that you want to create. First, let's start with defining what exactly culture is. Now, this is a term that gets bandied about quite a bit, but very few people really understand what does culture mean. So the way I define it is culture is how you do things in your organization. So effectively, it's your processes, your internal processes define your culture. So you could say that, our values are integrity and honesty and, transparency and, teamwork and all of this stuff. But if the way you do things do not reflect those values, then you don't have the culture that you think that you have. Okay, so let's jump into why you need to create an aspirational culture. Number one, it definitely helps with your hiring and firing decisions. So when you know what type of environment you're creating, it helps with knowing exactly who's going to fit into that environment. So when you're out recruiting, you're less inclined to get influenced by the flashy person who's able to interview amazingly but doesn't have the right attributes and the right persona to fit within your environment. Now, it also helps with firing decisions. So when somebody is behaving in a manner that is not conducive to the culture you're trying to create, it's important that you make that tough decision as quickly as possible. Nothing is worse than hanging on to somebody who is destroying your culture from the inside, slowly, one cut at a time. It's just not worth it. But the problem is that a lot of leaders and CEOs will tolerate bad behavior because they're really unsure or unclear what they want. So I'll give you an example. You have a salesperson. The salesperson is hitting it out of the park every single quarter, exceeding expectations, bringing in tons and tons of money into business, into the organization. Top salesperson, but they act like a jerk. They don't care for the team. They're in it for themselves. When there's events and things that you put on, they don't attend. They're rude to people that are quote unquote beneath them. And what happens is a lot of times CEOs will get caught up in that whole, well, I need to hold on to this person because they're bringing in so much of the business. Yeah, they behave like a jerk, but does it really matter? And, ultimately, how do we offset that? And they think that by coaching the employee, that's going to somehow fix the problem. And sometimes it does. There's no denying that. Coaching is definitely an appropriate solution for someone who doesn't fit the culture. But typically when they don't fit the culture, it's because they are just not wired that way. You just have to admit that you made a bad hiring decision. And so in that moment, when you're faced with that tough decision, top sales employee, but jerk on the other hand, what wins out? Like, which part of the balance is heavier for you? When you have an aspirational culture, when you have a culture in mind, your aspirational culture is defined, you know which one will win out. If your culture is all about performance and it doesn't matter how people behave, because really you're a performance driven organization, and there's nothing wrong with that, no culture is good or bad, then you know what choice you have to make. You're going to hold on to that top salesperson. But if you are creating a culture that's more collaborative, and that where you want senior people to mentor others, and that their sales results are less important than the congeniality of the team, and again, no right or wrong answers here, then you know that you need to get rid of that salesperson who's being a jerk. Having an aspirational culture also helps you define what your internal processes are going to look like. So, for example, if your internal culture is going to be all about service to your clients, and that is like your be all and end all, no matter what happens in the organization, you are going to service your clients, then your internal processes will reflect that. So the intent is for everything that you do in your company, what is the shortest and best possible way to do it so that the ultimate winner in all of that is the client or your customer. I have a video on how to create a talent strategy for small business, and you can catch it over here. In it, I talk about what are all of the things that inform your talent strategy, and part of those things inform how your internal processes work. So if you're clear on how you want your organization to look, how you want your people to behave, how you want work to be done, those internal processes will mirror your aspirational culture. You'll mirror how you have envisioned people should be doing work at your company. So having that culture defined in your brain and on paper so that everyone knows what it is crucial and extremely helpful in creating processes that work with that culture. The other thing that an aspirational culture will do is it will help you set employee and leader expectations. So going back to my first example around, which one wins out, top salesperson or jerk employee, and those things are basically decisions that you make with respect to employee and leader expectations. So do you expect that your leaders are going to have each other's back, or are you looking for top results no matter what? And again, yes, there are good and bad cultures. I know I said earlier that there's no good or bad. There are bad cultures. There are toxic cultures that are not of service to your employees or your customers, or really anybody for that matter. And so that does need to be looked at. But essentially, if you're all performing, in a respectful manner, then whether you're a high performance culture with respect to results, or you're a high performance culture with respect to collaboration within the team, it really doesn't matter. The intent here is for you to define what exactly it is that you want, because here's what happens when you don't define what you want. People will start acting the way they were raised in previous organizations, and they'll bring other companies' cultures into where you are. The problem with that is that the clients that you're servicing, the products and services that you're offering are different from where they came from. So you can't copy somebody else's culture. I also hear leaders sometimes say to me when they're creating this aspirational culture of why, we want to be like Google, when we want to offer all of these extra perks that Google offers. The problem is that you're not in the business that Google is in. It doesn't make any sense. So I think that when you're defining your culture, you also have to think about what makes sense from your product and services and client perspective. Because ultimately, we're all in this business to service our clients and to solve problems for our clients. And if what you're doing internally doesn't do that, then it's time for a revisit. Okay, so now that you know why you need to define an aspirational culture, and hopefully I've provided some pretty compelling reasons, let's talk a little bit about how to define your aspirational culture. Now, the first thing that you want to look at is your business goals and objectives and your vision. Where do you envision your business being in the next 10 years or 15 years? Ultimately, you're here in this role to create a legacy business. You're not in this role to be, a a placeholder of some sort, right? You want to move the business forward. And so you need to look far ahead into the future. Say, if we were to achieve what we want in the next 10 to 15 years, what type of company are we going to be? What type of people are we going to have? What type of processes and what type of behavior and what type of talent and skills and expertise and experience and backgrounds will the people in this organization have? Those are all things that you need to consider when you're defining your aspirational culture. And my suggestion would be to just list them out and use, you can use this as sort of a brainstorming approach and sit with your team or by yourself or whatever the case is and just come up with a list of ideas and of a vision of where you want to be and what that looks like in acute detail. Now, I did want to mention that I do have a video on how to create an aspirational culture, so you can check it out here. But the other thing to consider also is, where are you at today? So it's one thing to define where you want to go, but you also need to know where you're at today and what your existing culture actually is in order for you to know how to get to that end state. Because if you haven't created an aspirational culture from the startup stage of your business, and let's say you're 15 or 20 or 30 or 100 in your company, then you need to start somewhere, and you need to start with where you're at. It is possible to change company culture. Absolutely it is. And we can, at some point in the future, I'll talk about that as well in a future video, but you can change the culture. You just need to know where you're going and where you're at right now. The other thing to keep in mind as a small business CEO or owner, and particularly if you are an owner or a founder, what are your own personal values? Your own personal values will have a huge impact on your company culture that you're trying to create. And personal values comes from your past experience. So if you have grown up in an environment where things were very collaborative and things were, everyone needed to have consensus in order for things to move forward, more than likely those are the values that you're bringing forward and into the business today. And those are the values that you're probably going to use to influence what your aspirational culture will look like. The other thing to look at is the people around you and what are their values. So your trusted partners and advisors. Remember, the idea of defining your culture is not to make everyone exactly the same. All you're doing is defining the how work gets done and whether that is in service to your clients in one way or another way or a third way or a fourth way. Like, that's all that culture is. But you can have people from many different backgrounds and experiences in your organization that still sort of work within the culture. And possibly the final and most important thing to remember is that once you've defined this aspirational culture, the people are going to look to you as the leader for an example of how to behave. You and your direct report, so the senior leadership team. If you decide that you want people to behave in a certain way and you go out and you communicate it and you say that this is what needs to happen, if you're not embodying those behaviors and competencies and if you're not doing it that way, then chances are your employees aren't going to do it either. So that's something for you to really consider, that when you're defining this culture, it needs to be true to you and true to your team so that you can actually emulate that behavior for your employees. If you're ready to think about how to define your aspirational culture, then you'll want to consider joining our High Performance Culture Academy program. It is a 12-week intensive program that helps small business CEOs go from stressed and overworked to having a fully leveraged team that has a defined aspirational culture, that has a defined talent strategy, and that has internal people processes that match all of that so that you can achieve your goals as quickly as possible. And at the same time, get back a whole bunch of time because you're leveraging your team. In order to book a call with me to figure out if this program is going to be something that's the right fit for you, the link to book a call is in the description below. And I hope to see you on the other side. If you liked this video and you found value from it, please hit the like button below and comment and let me know what was your biggest takeaway? Like, what was like the aha moment that you had from this video today? Comment below. I love to read people's comments and I will reply, I promise. Now, I do have these other two videos for you to look at with respect to talent strategy and aspirational culture that I think that you should definitely check out in the meantime. I will be back next week, same time, same place, with another video on building and nurturing your high performance team. Bye.